Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, Cider Fauns. When I was writing up the fauns for the Magonomia Bestiary, I missed a trick. The player characters in that book discover that they can make faun-like creatures with different alcoholic beverages. I missed an important one: cider. Cider and beer have been rivals for English drinkers over the centuries, but cider is in the ascendant in the Ars Magica period. This is because one of its great cultural centres is in Normandy, and the 1066 invasion makes it popular with the upper classes. That's not to say cider wasn't already made elsewhere, it certainly was. It's just that when you look at the nobles, they are mostly wine drinkers in much of Europe. Among the peasants, it was also popular because it's cheaper to make than beer. It's cheaper to make cider because you don't need to boil the apple juice in the same way that you need to boil the barley mash. You don't need fuel because you don't need to boil, and that's handy in a kingdom which has deforested itself and not yet discovered the many uses of sea coal. Cider apples are usually picked in October during the period, which is after the many other duties of the agricultural year. If you look at the basic information about apple variants, you'll read there are three essential types of apple: the dessert, the cooking, and crab apples. That last one is the one used to make cider, and you'll read it's full of tannins which make it too astringent to eat, but which add flavour to the cider and clarify it. These divisions are essentially rubbish in modern Australia, and maybe where you are too. I've eaten apples that are sold as crab apples, and they're just dessert or cooking apples that are too small to be accepted by Australia's supermarkets. The favourite cooking apple in my country is the Granny Smith, and it's probably a weird natural mutation from the French crab apple, which is a cider apple that people also use in desserts. Basically, you can mix and match your apples to create different flavours and qualities. A better way of thinking about apples, a more modern way, but let's move it back into the game period, is along two axes between sweetness and acidity, and between bitterness and lack of bitterness. This divides apples into four groups, and I'd like to suggest that you can map these onto the four humours, so you can program the personality of the faun-like creatures that you're making with your cider. These types of apples are, first, the bitter sharp. The bitter sharp is your classic ancient cider apple. It can be used as a cider apple without being mixed with other apples. It's high in tannins, so it's bitter, and high in acid, so it's sharp. Acid slows the fermentation, but that's not a bad thing sometimes. It means your apple juice is less likely to pick up stray yeasts and ferment weirdly. Bittersweets. This is a high tannin apple, but it's low in acid, and so it tastes sweeter compared to the bitter sharp. Lower acid in the juice makes fermentation faster, which lets you speed up your cider making and bulk out the amount of cider you get. Sharp, or in the French system, acidic, is the third type of apple, and it's a low tannin, high acid apple. It's added to up the acidity level so that the apple juice gets preserved, as mentioned before. A lot of cooking apples are sharps. They generally don't taste sharp once you've cooked them because the heat breaks down the acidity. Granny Smiths, for example, are sharp apples. To show you how useless the three-way division is, if you've ever had cider made out of Harrison cider apples, my American listeners, that's also technically a sharp apple. And the fourth type are sweet apples, and that's a high-sugar, low-acidity apple. Basically, any table apple. Sugar doesn't add a lot of flavour to, well, anything. But it does add extra alcohol after the fermentation process, so it's handy to have, particularly early in the faun chapter where you're looking for very potent alcohols. So you'd load up on sweet apples when making your original fauns. In the four humour model, that would push all of these fauns towards the sanguine humour, and your tuning would be along the tannic axis, so you could push some into phlegmatic by making the cider more bitter. After you work out that the strength of the alcohol doesn't matter, which leads to the partier creations, you could pull back on the sugar and add more sharpness, acid, to pull your fauns back toward melancholic and phlegmatic, and I'd argue Seleni are pretty phlegmatic to begin with. So you might be able to make something a little bit more like them in that way. Would there be a physical divergence? I've thought about these creatures as a sort of wood woes. But I'm not tied to that idea. I've also considered having them as serpent people. Just a brief and embarrassing note. When I was looking at the history of cider making, I came across wassailing, which is a Christmas custom. A wassail bowl is a bowl that's passed around at a feast, usually a Christmas feast, to allow everyone to drink together. And wassailing is also the practice of going out into the orchard and either pouring cider on the trees or throwing bits of cake into the tree or leaving apples around the place to make sure that the harvest of the next year was good. And in the book that I was reading, it says that it usually occurs on January the 5th, on Twelfth Night. And I didn't realise they were the same custom. I thought, wait a minute, wassailing doesn't happen in January, wassailing happens in May. And of course that's because I'm an Australian. And so here, wassailing, at least locally, happens in May. And I didn't realise that the two traditions were tied together. I thought they just happened to have a similar name. Anyway, such minor historical embarrassments aside, your saga may vary.